And what is his ultimate purpose? What is the story of Exodus? What does it teach us about God's will? What's his purpose through the story of Exodus?
Bring mankind back to him.
That's the ultimate purpose, right? That's exactly what it's about. Now, it's dealing with the Jews, with Israel at that time. But the ultimate purpose, like Scott said, is the redemption of mankind. That's what he's doing. And you have to remember this. If you don't remember this, then you can get caught up with, well, why did he choose Jacob over Esau? It says that Jacob and Esau, neither one of them had done anything good or bad. And yet he chose Jacob instead of Esau. That's not fair. Right? You have to keep in mind what God's doing. Why is God using Pharaoh and Moses in Israel? Well, he wants to keep Israel, the promises that he made through Abraham, he's going to keep it through Israel. But the ultimate goal is that he's going to redeem mankind. And it says here that God raised Pharaoh up for the very purpose of displaying his power. And then it says that God hardened Pharaoh's heart. Now here's a question for you. Does that mean that Pharaoh had no choice in what happened in Exodus? Very good. Chapter 8. So if you read chapter 7, it says God hardened Pharaoh's heart. If you turn over to chapter 8, when the frogs were on them and they hated the frogs so bad, he comes to Moses and Aaron. This is Pharaoh. And he says, please do something about these frogs. Please go ask God to get rid of them. And Moses said, okay, we will. And he goes and asks God to get rid of the frogs, and God does. And then it says, Pharaoh's heart, and after it was over, instead of complying with what God had wanted Pharaoh to do, it says that Pharaoh hardened his own heart and would not let the people go. So what you see here is you have an ultimately sovereign God who can accomplish his will and still allow us to make free choices. If you don't have a God that can accomplish his sovereign will in spite of our own free choices, in other words, if he has to direct everything that you do, in my mind, that diminishes the omniscience, the power, the knowledge of God. Does that make sense? So when he
what Moses and what Pharaoh's heart was going to be, and that's why he chose them to begin with.
That kind of goes back to election and predestination. He knew how things would go. I can say that. But I don't want to stray from the fact that they still made choices. They still made choices. If you try to put it towards where God is pulling the strings behind the scenes, influencing or forcing Moses to make certain choices and Pharaoh to make certain choices, then you're taking away free will from man, and that's not something that I don't believe that the text teaches that. Scott?
I too have struggled in the past with and God hardened someone's heart. That's not an easy thing to understand. But when you look at it from the perspective that God has the power that he could have absolutely convinced Pharaoh that he is God.
Yeah.
God could have done whatever miracle it took.
Well, he did a bunch of them.
Yeah, but he could have
Yeah.
convinced Pharaoh. God's all powerful.
Mhm.
And he knows how you think. He could have provided the evidence that would have made Pharaoh say, okay, you're right. But he didn't force Pharaoh into that. He gave him plenty of evidence that, as we would say in the court, any reasonable
Yeah.
And yet Pharaoh chose not to come to that conclusion. God has the power that he, you know, we have that capability. When we know something that somebody else doesn't, we have a choice on how much information we feed them
Mhm.
to educate them on something. God wasn't going to go to some irrational extreme to convince Pharaoh of anything. He gave him all he needed to draw the correct conclusion, and yet Pharaoh chose not to, and God allowed him to
Yeah.
come to that conclusion.
And another good point to come back to is there will be a time in history when Christ returns, and he will force every single person that has ever lived and everybody that's alive then to acknowledge that he is God. Yeah, that's right. We're not there yet, right? And the reason we're not is because God is long-suffering. This goes back to what he's talked about before. God is waiting for us to make the right choice, right? He could force us to, but he wants us to do it on our own. Very good comment. Anything else?
I think basically this too is, we have to think from the context of Romans 9, I think you see this more in Romans 9 than you do necessarily in Exodus 7. But in Romans 9, the plan is what the main point is.
Mhm.
And so in Romans 9, it's the plan that hardened everybody's heart.
Yes.
Not necessarily God himself doing something outside of his own will or something like that. It's the plan itself that
Yeah.
hardened them. And from that perspective, you could say the exact same thing, which Paul's going to make application to all people here in just a little bit
Mhm.
on this. He can harden whoever he wills. Yeah, he does that, but he does that through his plan.
Yeah.
He has decided the way that all mankind is going to be saved, and it has to be his way, or it's no way at all.
Right.
Because that's what he's designed.
Mhm.
If we choose to go against that, then yes, God has hardened everybody, but he's done so through his plan.
Yeah. Shirley?
Basically, what Peter was saying,
Yeah.
but here in Romans 9, Paul is convincing the Jews, bottom line, that God has the right to reject believers, to reject unbelievers, and to accept believers
Yeah.
in the Messiah.
Yeah.
So that's the
That's the underlying
that's
point.
his plan.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree.
Yeah.
And he's going to give you
Using illustrations
that they would understand.
that they would understand
Yeah.
and they would agree with.
Which brings to another point. You got to keep this in mind in Romans. Sometimes he is making points to the entire church at Rome about general things, and sometimes he's specifically talking to the Jewish Christians at Rome. And this is one of those instances. Yeah. Very good. What else?
My version says that he makes some people stubborn.
I think he made me stubborn. I don't know. Did he make Stuart stubborn?
Yeah.
That's a natural human tendency, right? But some people, God makes more stubborn than others, maybe, and they resist. There's this idea of, here's a really good question. We'll ask it when we get to 10. When you think about the righteousness of God, and this kind of goes back to the point that Mitchell made. When you think about the righteousness of God, we are declared righteous because of his righteousness, right? All right. Is God's righteousness something that we accept, or is it something we submit to? I think it's both. But most people err on the side of, well, it's a gift that God gives us, and it is. It's something that we have to accept. But once we accept it, then we have to submit to his will. There are consequences for accepting the righteousness of God. We have to, after we accept the righteousness of God, he's declared us righteous, then it brings to bear God's will on our lives. And he heed, that we have to submit to His will for our lives instead of our own. Scott?
But God did say, you must not eat from the fruit that is in the middle of the garden, and you must not touch it, or you will die. You will not certainly die, the serpent said to the woman, for God knows that when you eat from it, your eyes will be open. You will be like God, knowing good and evil.
Yeah.
That's the exact same issue man has had from that moment.
Yeah.
God says this, Satan says, oh no.
You don't really have to do
And
that.
we make a choice.
Yeah.
And it's, I think that's the battle that's gone from before.
Yeah. And it just takes different forms. What else? I'm enjoying the conversation. All right, so we're talking about how omniscient that God is, how He can accomplish His will, and allow for our free will. I'll give you another example of this. Was it God's will, I ask you this question, was it God's will that Jesus would be handed over to be crucified? Yeah. That was the plan, right? Did Judas choose to do that? Yeah, he made the choice. He traded Christ for 30 pieces of silver, right? So to kind of wrap this up, I'll just say this. When God moves in the history of the world, it's always on God's own time. And it's at the place or at the time of His choosing. We can't force God's hand in anything. All right?
He doesn't force our
No.
We make the choice.
Yes.
Is what I mean.
Yes. But we can't make Him do anything either.
No.
You know.
He's superior.
Yeah. All right. So let's move on to verses 19 through 21 because this is gonna still factor in here. Somebody read verses 19 through 21 for us.
Will say to me then, why does he still find fault? For who has resisted his will? But indeed, O man, who are you to reply against God? Will the things formed say to him, who formed it, why have you made me like this? Does not the potter have power over the clay for the same lump, one vessel for honor and another for dishonor?
Go ahead and read through verse 24. I'm sorry.
What if God, wanting to show His wrath and to make His power known, endured much long suffering the vessels of wrath prepared to destruction, and that He might make known the riches of His glory on the vessels of mercy, which He had prepared beforehand for glory, even us whom He calls, not of the Jews only, but also of the Gentiles.
Okay. So that's going to hold us in here. Paul's going to make an ultimate conclusion here. And like I said, up to this point, the Jews would have largely agreed with everything that Paul said. Most of it anyways. It's not until we get to verse 24 that the Jews would say, hold on, wait a minute. Because verse 24 says, even us whom He called, not of the Jews only, but also of the Gentiles. That's what he's been building to. He's making the point, like Shirley said, that's what the point of 9 has been for the most part. There's been other rabbit trails you could chase there, but this is what he's building towards. Hey, it's not just you, it's also the Gentiles. And there's this logical question that comes that you could see the Jews asking. And they would say something like, if God is in control and He's calling the shots, if He's sovereign, and we were all going to do what He wanted us to do anyways, why does He find fault? Now, this is logical if you have basically if your perception of reality is centered on man or yourself, humankind. If your perception, if your view of the world is human-centered, then it's absolutely logical and probably acceptable for you to ask this question. But if your view of the universe is God-centric, this is not even a question you would ask. Right? And it goes back to this idea of, who are we to question God? Will the thing formed to him say to him who formed it, why have you made me like this? If you go back to what Paul says here, you notice he asks a question, and then he really doesn't answer the question. He tells you the question's pretty much out of bounds. God's already allowed himself in Paul's writing to be subjected to scrutiny back in chapter 3. If you look at verses 1 through 5, in fact, let's just go read it. Romans chapter 3, verses 1 through 5. This is Paul's sort of imaginary opponent. What advantage then has the Jew, or what is the profit of circumcision? Much in every way, chiefly because to them were committed the oracles of God. For what if some did not believe? Will their unbelief make the faithfulness of God without effect? Certainly not. Indeed, let it be true. Let God be true, but every man a liar, as it's written, that you may be justified in your words and may overcome when you are judged. But if our unrighteousness demonstrates the righteousness of God, what shall we say then? Is God unjust who inflicts wrath? He says, I'm speaking as a man. That's kind of how he ends it. That's the same point he's making here in 9. He's saying, well, if I'm a man and I look at everything through the lens of how it affects me and I'm the center of the universe, you can ask that question if you want. But if you see God as the center of the universe, you don't question it at all. God does what he wants to do. God is above all reproach from mankind. God said, here Paul's basically saying that God's the author, the maker, and the creator of man. Could the thing made question the one who made it? That'd be kind of like allowing the character of your favorite novel to critique the author. Right? Might be a silly exercise, a mental exercise you could run through, but is it really, it's ludicrous to think that that's something you would put weight in, right? And this kind of goes back to, he's going back to Isaiah 29:16, is talking about the potter and the clay. Reminds me as well of Job's encounter with God. No matter how you interpret this passage of Scripture, whether doctrinally or theologically, I think there's a truth here that I don't think anyone, at least not Christians, will even attempt to argue, that God is sovereign. He can do with His creation what He wants to do. It's not really even a question. Probably the question we should be asking with this, instead of saying, what if He wanted to do all this? The better question is, what has He done? Right? What has He been working to accomplish with His creation? How has He constructed His people? How has He constructed the world that we live in? How has He put together the plan of salvation? That's the issue. God is in control. We've made that, I think, blatantly clear. And if He is, what's He doing? Well, it goes back to what Scott said. He's redeeming mankind. That, I think, is the proper line of thinking. And then he raises another hypothetical. He says, what if God wanted to make two types of vessels? This is in verse 22. What if God had one for wrath and one for glory? A lot of people read predestination in this. They look at it and say, well, that's exactly what God did. He predestined some people to be saved, and He chose. That's not what I see here. And the problem is they're ignoring the context of chapter 9, really of the whole book, but of chapter 9 completely, because God's been talking about peoples, not persons, right? Nations, not. He calls Israel Jacob, he calls Edom Esau. He's not talking about individuals, he's talking about nations. And the people that I think misapply this, they bring this down to individuals because it fits. They're reading their theology onto what the text says. And I think we're going to see when we get to 10, this can't possibly. This I think is one of the stronger arguments against predestination, because if God chose some people to be saved in heaven and some people to be destroyed in hell forever, then what do we do with the Jews? When you get to chapter 10, it says, Paul says, my heart's desire and prayer to God for Israel, he's talking about the nation, this is verse 1, is that they might be saved. And if you keep reading there, eventually what you come up with, the idea is, the reason that Israel is not going to be saved, or the most of them is not going to be saved, is not because God predestined them to heaven or hell. It's because of a lack of knowledge that they have. They have zeal without knowledge. That's basically what he's saying. So it's something that they were more in control of than God was. It proves people's own choice. And to kind of sew this up about it being nations instead of peoples, verse 24 kind of brings it all back in together. Because in verse 24 he says, even us whom he called, he's talking about Israel, not of the Jews only, but also the Gentiles. That's nations. That's ethnic peoples, not individuals. Okay? Any questions or comments about that so far?
Predestination creates more problems than it answers in that. Number one, if it's all predetermined, who cares about Satan or any of that, because it's irrelevant. If it's all predetermined, what is the purpose of the whole physical experience anyway there? Just skip to the heaven part. The whole physical experience is that period where your eternal soul has that opportunity to make choices and determine your own destiny. Because we know in heaven there is no sin, there is no,
Right.
there would be no choosing to do wrong.
Yeah.
Sin cannot be. And so you have to ask, if it's all predetermined, what would be the whole point of this physical experience?
I've often wondered why people that believe that even preach at all. What's the point of it? Now, they'll tell you, well, we don't know who's predestined and who's not, so we're going to preach to everybody. But if predestination is true, unconditional election is what is right in there with it, then there's no sense in preaching. No, it's already done.
If
Yeah.
predestination was true, why would he have instituted the whole sacrifice?
Or again and again told us to choose.
Yeah.
Choose this day who you'll serve.
They had to sacrifice to cleanse themselves of their sin for the year.
Yeah.
You know, why would he have instituted the whole sacrifice? I mean, they had sacrifices for everything, and there would have been no need for sacrifices at all.
Yeah. Yep. I don't see, I mean, I understand why they preach it, because I was in that for a long time. It may be completely foreign to you guys, I don't know. But you need to be aware of it, because you're going to run into somebody who believes this. And it might be the only way that you can actually reach them with the gospel is to prove to them that the gospel isn't this, right? That's why I'm kind of harping on it. But anyway, I got off track there a little bit. He's saying we don't have a right to question God. His point has been through this chapter that the Jews who objected to Gentiles not keeping the law of Moses, or that all this stuff that they didn't have to do, that they were included, they just didn't think this was fair. And I've one of the ways to look at this is Paul's argument all along has been that there are lots of people, and even whole nations, that physically had Abraham's DNA. They were physically descended from Abraham. They weren't all chosen. The promise did not come through all of them. And that's what Paul's getting at here. And maybe this is a good place to talk about it. When you think about the Jews' view of the world and their misconceptions about the Messiah, what did they expect the Messiah to be and do? A king on earth? Okay, what somebody? King on earth. But what did they want him to do? He wanted them to get rid of, it wasn't just the Romans. That's the thing. So everything that the Jews knew about the Messiah was framed through the idea of David. They would go back and point to David and be like, remember how it was when David was king and we were ascendant? We controlled everybody around us. Really, Solomon, after him, David's son. When everybody comes to Solomon because he's so wise, they're bringing him gifts. That's what they wanted. That's what they thought the Messiah was going to be. What does that say about their view of everybody else? Yeah. That's the problem. That's the problem he's dealing with here in Rome, in Romans. It seems like the Jews wanted to hoard all of God's blessings to themselves.
It was their birthright.
Exactly. That's what he's preaching against here. He's telling them, hey, you're no better than these Gentiles that you look down on all the time. That's why they missed the Messiah. They were looking for a physical king, like he said, that would get rid of the Romans, that would conquer everybody else and put them at the top of the heap. Here's the irony. Had they been able to ask David, what do you think the Messiah will look like? He would have pointed to Christ. And they missed it.
Well, the promise to Abraham was, through your seed, all the nations of the earth shall be blessed.
Yep.
And the Jews stopped at through your seed.
Yeah.
That was the key point to them. Is, it's through us. And kind of lost sight of the whole, all the nations of the earth shall be blessed.
Yep.
Which was the major point being made in that promise.
Well, and it gets back to this idea of, I don't know if you guys have ever heard this term. Maybe you have. You ever heard the term entitlement? Is that a if you call somebody entitled, is that a good thing or a bad thing? A lot of people would view that as an insult, right? It's exactly how the Jews felt. We kept the law. We circumcised our sons. We didn't eat pork. We didn't mix fat. We did all these things. If you focus on that part of it, eventually what happens is God owes us.
Well, the sad thing is, they failed in that percentage.
Oh yeah, that's kind of looking back at their own history with rose-colored glasses, right? Seeing only the good things that they want to see.
Raise up someone to bring them back into life.
Yeah, and that's what we're going to get to. Let's go ahead and move on through. I'm going to try to get through. We may not make it. Let's go ahead and go to verse 25. Paul's still continuing there. He says, as he also says in Hosea, I will call them my people who were not my people, and her beloved who was not beloved. And it shall come to pass in the place where it was said to them, you are not my people, there they shall be called sons of the living God. Isaiah also cries out concerning Israel, though the number of the children of Israel be as the sand of the sea, the remnant will be saved. For he will finish the work and cut it short in righteousness, because the Lord will make a short work upon the earth. Verse 29 is, and as Isaiah said before, unless the Lord of Sabaoth had left us a seed, we would have become like Sodom, and we would have been made like Gomorrah. He's going back to, this is really kind of putting the icing on the cake for the argument that he's been making. He's going back and showing them, just like Scott was saying, you think you were doing really well. That's not really true. The truth is, God was long-suffering with you. He constantly called you back. Hosea, have you guys read Hosea? The whole premise of Hosea, or part of it at least, is that Hosea is told to go marry a prostitute. And she's terribly unfaithful to him. And every time she goes and prostitutes herself with somebody else, God tells Hosea, go get her. And he does this because he's teaching them how he sees Israel. I've loved you in a way that should have won your hearts over to me completely. And yet every time you're tempted, you follow somebody else. You go to this other god. A lot of times it was Baal or Ishtar or some of these other ones. And you go worship with them. That's the whole point of Hosea. That's what he's telling them here. And he's reinforcing the fact that I'm going to call them my people who were not my people. Who do you think that is? It is. It's the Gentiles, right? There were God's people who were Israel and everybody else. I'm going to call those people who are not my people, and her beloved who was not beloved. And it'll come to pass in the place where it said to them, you're not my people, there they'll be called the sons of the living God. No matter how often Israel went and prostituted themselves with other gods, God always brought them back. And Israel sort of operates with the blinders of the law of Moses. So they always see things as pertaining only to them. Because to them, they were the center of the universe, right? In Isaiah, they should have known they were not much better than anybody else. Only a remnant of Israel would be saved. And had God not interceded on their behalf, they would have gone the way of Sodom and Gomorrah. When I say a remnant, or when God says a remnant, does that mean most of them? Does it mean half of them? It means a few of them, right? Yeah. It's like saying I planted 100 tomato plants and a couple of them bore fruit, right? It's exactly what he's getting at here. Yeah, just a little bit. That's been the plan all along. Not that God wanted all these people not to come to faith. He just knew that's what would happen, right? And we haven't gotten to it yet, but at some point we're going to talk about Israel as God sees it as opposed to how people see it. We got about 5 minutes left. Has the first bell rung? Okay, all right, let's try it. Let's go to verse 30. What shall we say then? That Gentiles who did not pursue righteousness have attained to righteousness, even the righteousness of faith. But Israel, pursuing the law of righteousness, has not attained to the law of righteousness. Why? Because they did not seek it by faith, but as it were, by the works of the law. For they stumbled at that stumbling stone. Verse 33, as it is written, behold, I lay in Zion a stumbling stone and rock of offense, and whoever believes on him who will not be put to shame. This is where I was talking about. If you go ahead and read the first 4 verses of chapter 10, fact, let's do that. Just stay with me. Go on to chapter 10. Brethren, my heart's desire and prayer to God for Israel is that they may be saved. For I bear them witness that they have a zeal for God, but not according to knowledge. For they, being ignorant of God's righteousness, and seeking to establish their own righteousness, have not submitted to the righteousness of God. For Christ is the end of the law for righteousness to everyone who believes. That works well together. That's the complete thought there. There's a bunch here. Let me just quickly talk about this stumbling block. This was one of the coolest things that I'd read. So he says, "Behold, I lay in Zion a stumbling stone and a rock of offense, and whoever believes on him will not be put to shame." Who is that? Who is the stumbling stone in Zion? It's Jesus, right? This goes back to Isaiah 28. And really, if you go to, if you really want to get the full part of it, we won't go there all the way, but Isaiah, I think it's 7 and 8, you see that God's going to bring judgment on the northern tribes, and he sees these armies kind of getting together. They're going to come after him. And the people in Jerusalem, the southern tribes, I think at the time was probably Hezekiah. But then when I read 7 and 8, it's Ahaz they're talking about. So I'm a little bit confused on the timeline, but I know it's around that same time. God tells Isaiah, he says, you and your son, I can't remember what his son's name is you go to Ahaz and tell him that all this stuff that you see happening, don't worry about it. In 65 years, Ephraim will be gone. And Ahaz, they go and tell Ahaz this. They say, God, basically they're telling him that God's got a plan and you need to trust in it. And Ahaz says, I'm not going to inquire God about anything. And the reason he does that is because he's been going out and making these side treaties with Egypt, Syria, some of these other places. And when you get to Isaiah 28, Isaiah starts talking about this covenant with Sheol. 28:16 is where it talks about the rock of offense. He talks about this covenant with Sheol, covenant with death. And basically, to boil all this down, the leaders in Jerusalem had put more faith and trust in the side deals that they had made to preserve themselves than they did in God, who had a plan to save them. And this is just sort of a metaphor for really Romans in general. So here's the question I guess I'll end with here. When it says in verse 10, it says that, not verse 10, chapter 10, it says, for they